The scream cut through the night like a knife. A mother's worst nightmare. Her child, gone in the blink of an eye. The streets of Springfield had always been quiet. A peaceful town where nothing ever seemed to go wrong. Nestled between the rolling hills and endless fields of corn, it was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names. And the biggest scandal was someone's dog getting loose. But tonight, something was wrong. Something dark had slithered into the heart of this seemingly perfect town. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Lily Thompson disappeared. Her mother, Julia, woke to the sound of an eerie silence. The usual hum of the night, the crickets, the wind rustling through the trees, was gone. She got out of bed, heart pounding in her chest. Something was missing. A chill ran down her spine, and she knew. Lily, her 7-year-old daughter, was gone. She rushed to Lily's room, but the bed was empty. The window was wide open, the curtain billowing slightly from the night air. The only sign of a struggle was the faint outline of tiny footprints in the dust on the floor, leading to the window. Julia screamed for her husband, Mark, but the silence that answered her only deepened her fear. Lily was gone. The panic set in as quickly as the fear. Julia grabbed her phone and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher answered, but Julia could barely speak through her sobs. "My daughter? She's gone. Someone took her." The words sounded too unreal, too impossible to be true. As the minutes ticked by, the weight of the situation sunk deeper into Julia's chest. What kind of person takes a child from her own bed? And why? It wasn't long before the police arrived, flashing lights slicing through the darkness. But even with the full force of law enforcement on the case, there were no leads, no signs of a struggle, nothing that pointed to who could have done this. They canvassed the neighborhood, asked questions, and checked every possible lead, but no one had seen anything. That's when the K-9 unit was called in. Officer Brian Harris had been on the force for 10 years, and he'd seen his fair share of strange cases. But there was something different about this one. It wasn't just the calm of the town or the bizarre way Lily had vanished. It was the instinct that told him this wasn't a random kidnapping. This was calculated. This was personal. His partner, K-9 Duke, was an experienced German shepherd, known for his intelligence and loyalty. The moment Brian brought Duke to the scene, the dog's ears perked up, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. It was clear to Brian that Duke wasn't following the usual path of a missing child case. There was something more. Duke immediately took to the ground, sniffing the dirt around the Thompson family's home, his tail stiff with focus. Brian's heart pounded as he followed Duke's lead. The dog's ability to track was extraordinary, and in a situation like this, it could be the key to finding Lily before it was too late. As they moved down the street, Duke led them straight to the small, old church at the end of the block. It wasn't much, just a few stained glass windows and a crumbling stone foundation. But there was something about the place that made the hairs on the back of Brian's neck stand up. The dog's sniffing grew more intense as they neared the church's entrance. Duke's gaze never wavered as he approached a nearby alley, then paused in front of a locked wooden door at the side of the building. Brian's heart skipped a beat. It didn't make sense. Why would the trail lead here? This wasn't the kind of place someone would take a child. The door was old, the wood worn with age, but there was something strange about it. Something that didn't sit right with Brian. Without a second thought, he knelt beside Duke and tried the door. It was locked tight, but the dog's sharp barking told him they were close. "Come on, boy. Let's see what's inside," Brian muttered, trying the door again with more force. Before he could push any harder, the door creaked open on its own, as if something or someone had been waiting for them. As they stepped inside, the air was thick with dust. the dim light from outside barely illuminating the narrow hallway. There was an old, eerie feel to the place, like it had been abandoned for years. But then they heard it, a faint sound, like the softest whisper, coming from deeper within the building. Duke's ears shot up, his body rigid. He growled low in his throat. Without a second thought, Brian followed Duke into the darkness, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The faint cry grew louder, a voice, a child's voice. And then, as they turned the corner, they saw her, Lily, tied to a chair, gagged, and her wide, terrified eyes locked onto theirs. The moment she saw Brian and Duke, relief flooded her face. She was alive. But as they rushed forward to untie her, the figure of a woman appeared from the shadows. Dressed in a nun's habit, her face was obscured by the dark veil she wore. But there was no mistaking the malicious gleam in her eyes. She wasn't here to pray. She was here for something far worse. "You need to get out of here, now," the woman hissed, her voice cold and venomous. But before Brian could react, Duke was already on the move, lunging toward the woman in a flash of fur and teeth. The fight had begun. Don't forget to subscribe to Heroes for Animals to follow Duke's journey in uncovering the truth behind the dark secrets of the town. Stay tuned for the next part of this incredible, real-life rescue. The suspense builds with every turn. What does this woman want with Lily? Why was she hiding in the church? And will Canine Duke be able to stop her before it's too late? The cold stone walls of the church felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the warm summer night outside. Officer Brian Harris barely had time to process the shock of seeing Lily tied to a chair when the woman, Sister Margaret, or so she appeared, moved like a shadow in the corner of his vision. Duke, his ever-loyal canine partner, had already gone into action. The moment the woman appeared from the shadows, Duke was on her in a split second, a blur of muscle and instinct. Brian could hear the snarl in the dog's throat, the low growl that warned anyone within earshot that this wasn't just a dog. This was a protector, and he wasn't about to let anyone harm his partner or the child in need. "Duke, stop!" Brian shouted, his voice gruff with urgency. But the dog was relentless. His teeth sunk into the fabric of the nun's habit, dragging her back with a force that made her stumble. She yelped in surprise, her hands flailing, but Duke's grip was firm, his powerful jaws refusing to release their hold. The woman, flailing and struggling against Duke, screamed, "You'll regret this! You have no idea who you're dealing with!" But Brian wasn't listening. He was too focused on Lily, her terrified eyes locked on him, her body shaking from fear. He rushed to her side, cutting the ropes that bound her to the chair with a pocket knife, his hands shaking as the reality of the situation set in. She was alive. Thank God. She was alive. But there was something about her that seemed almost too calm, too resigned. As soon as Lily was free, she jumped up from the chair, but instead of running into Brian's arms, she stepped back. Her small voice trembled as she spoke. "She told me not to scream. She said I'd be safe if I didn't scream." Brian's heart dropped into his stomach. The woman had been grooming Lily, manipulating her into submission. It wasn't just about taking her. It was about breaking her, bending her will, making her believe there was no escape. Brian wanted to comfort Lily, to reassure her that it was over. But the woman, Sister Margaret, wasn't done yet. With a sharp tug, Duke finally released his grip on the woman's habit, and she scrambled to her feet, glaring at Brian with fury. Her hands shook with rage as she adjusted her veil, revealing her cold, calculating eyes. There was nothing maternal or nurturing about her, no kindness, no warmth. This was the face of someone who had lived in the shadows for too long, someone who had woven a web of lies so thick that no one would have suspected her true intentions. "You're making a big mistake," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you've stopped me? But I'm just the beginning. You have no idea what you're up against." Brian took a step forward, positioning himself between the woman and Lily, his hand instinctively resting on Duke's harness. The dog, still growling, was ready to strike at a moment's notice. But Brian knew they couldn't fight this out. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. "You're not a nun, are you?" Brian said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "You're not even close. Who the hell are you?" The woman smirked, a twisted grin forming on her lips. She took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the stone floor. "I'm exactly who I need to be. And you're right. This place, this act, it's all a disguise. But who would question a nun? Who would ever suspect someone like me?" Brian's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was a part of something bigger, something far darker. "We've been tracking you for months," she continued, her tone suddenly calm, almost amused. "I'm not just a rogue agent. I've been running things for years, building a network of loyal followers, people who believe in what I do, people who trust me. You think I just took Lily for the thrill of it? No. She's a pawn in something much more dangerous." Brian's mind raced. There was no way she could be talking about what he thought she was talking about. But every word she spoke felt like a chilling confirmation. "You're part of a trafficking ring," he said, his voice barely a whisper, the horror of it sinking in. "You've been using this church as a front, haven't you?" Sister Margaret's eyes sparkled with pride, like a cat who had cornered its prey. "Trafficking? Oh no, that's the old-fashioned way of thinking. I'm building something much more refined. The children, like Lily, are just the beginning. They have roles to play, roles in a much bigger game." Brian's stomach turned. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop her, to end this nightmare before it could spiral further. But there was something more here, something that went beyond the kidnapping. He turned to Lily, who was now standing next to him, her small face pale with fear. "Lily, are you okay?" She nodded slowly, her eyes wide, but she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The fear was evident in every inch of her trembling body. It wasn't just fear of the woman in front of them. It was fear of what the woman represented. Fear of what had been done to her mind. "I don't want to go back," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to go with her again." Brian's heart clenched. "You're not going anywhere, sweetheart. You're safe now. We're getting you out of here." But Sister Margaret wasn't finished. She stepped forward again, her smile turning cruel. "You think this is over? You think you've won? You don't even know what I'm capable of. You're all just pieces in my game, and I never lose." Brian had heard enough. He reached for his radio, signaling for backup, but before he could speak, Sister Margaret lunged at him, knocking the radio from his hand. Duke barked loudly, his body launching at the woman once more, his teeth bared in fury. But Brian was already moving. He grabbed the woman by the arm, twisting it behind her back and slamming her to the ground with a force that made her gasp in pain. "Don't underestimate me," Brian growled. "You're done." Sister Margaret struggled beneath him, but she didn't resist for long. Her energy had waned. The fight had left her when Duke had torn through her defenses. She knew it was over. But she wasn't going down without one final message. "You won't stop me," she hissed through gritted teeth. "The people I work for. They'll never let you win. I'll be back. We'll all be back." Her words hung in the air, a chilling warning. But Brian wasn't going to let that thought linger. He stood, keeping a firm hold on her, and called for backup again. This time, he wasn't just dealing with a kidnapper. He was dealing with a criminal mastermind. And he was about to find out just how far her reach went. Outside, the flashing lights of squad cars lit up the street as officers arrived. The nightmare wasn't over yet. But for now, Lily was safe. And that's all that mattered. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Sister Margaret hadn't worn off yet. But Officer Brian Harris knew the worst was far from over. As he stood by the squad car, watching the police officers take the woman away, his mind raced. The last few hours had been a blur of chaos and confusion. But one thing was clear now. They had only scratched the surface of something much larger. Sister Margaret was just a small piece of a dangerous puzzle, and the way she'd spoken, the way she'd hinted at a larger operation, left Brian with a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't just about a kidnapped girl. This was about a criminal network, something much darker and more organized. And the thought that a place like this, a small town like Springfield, could harbor such evil was hard to process. Lily was sitting in the back of a patrol car now, wrapped in a blanket, her small body still trembling from the trauma she'd endured. The officers had asked her questions, but she was too scared to answer. She kept her head down, her face buried in the fabric, as if trying to hide from the horrors she had seen. But there was something else in her eyes, a glimmer of defiance, a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she would be able to put the nightmare behind her. But Brian knew better. He had seen enough cases to understand that the aftermath of something like this didn't end with a rescue. The damage ran deep, and as much as he wanted to believe that Sister Margaret was just a rogue agent, a lunatic operating in isolation, something told him that wasn't the case. There had to be others. There always were. The first thing Brian did when he got back to the station was call in the K9 unit. Duke had done more than just find Lily. The dog's incredible nose had led them to Sister Margaret, but it had also uncovered a trail that Brian was determined to follow. He needed answers. The kind of answers that could take down the whole operation. "Let's run through everything again," Brian said, leaning over the desk, his eyes scanning the evidence that had been collected. The officers had searched Sister Margaret's van, and what they found was chilling. A collection of passports, fake IDs, and a stack of photographs. All the faces in the photos were of young girls. Most of them had been taken recently, within the last few months. They were all smiling, posing in front of different landmarks. But something about the images was wrong. It wasn't just the forced smiles. It was the sense of ownership that seemed to radiate from each photograph. Brian's hand trembled as he picked up the last photo in the pile. A young girl, no older than Lily, standing in front of a church. She was looking directly at the camera, but her eyes weren't filled with hope. They were empty, lifeless, like someone who had already given up. "Where did this come from?" Brian muttered to himself. The address written on the back of the photo was a place Brian knew well. It was an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a location that had been abandoned for years. He'd driven by it countless times, but never once thought to look inside. Now he knew he had no choice. If he was going to stop this network from spreading, he needed to investigate every lead, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. Meanwhile, Lily's parents were at the station, sitting in a room with a counselor, trying to piece together the events of the last few days. Brian couldn't bring himself to look them in the eye yet. He knew that they were grateful, beyond grateful, that Lily was safe. But there was something else there, something unspoken. The terror of knowing that their little girl had been so close to something so evil. As the clock ticked, Brian reviewed the information he had. He needed to move fast. He couldn't afford to waste time second-guessing himself. "Duke," Brian muttered under his breath, "what else do you know?" The dog had been a key part of this investigation, and Brian was certain that Duke was sensing more than anyone realized. The way the dog had reacted when they arrived at Sister Margaret's hideout was more than just instinct. It was a warning. The scent of fear in the air had been thick, but there was something else, something darker. Brian looked down at the photos again. The faces of the girls stared back at him. They were innocent, just like Lily, trapped in a system that had been operating right under everyone's noses. He couldn't help but wonder how many more there were. How many had already disappeared? With a sense of determination setting in, Brian stood up. "I'm going to the warehouse," he said aloud, as if speaking to himself, but also to Duke, who was resting by the door, his ears perked. The drive to the warehouse felt like an eternity. The air was thick with anticipation, and the closer Brian got, the more his stomach twisted. His thoughts kept racing back to the photo he'd seen. The girl standing in front of the church. It was too coincidental. It couldn't be a random location. The church had to be connected. The warehouse was nestled in the middle of a secluded industrial park. The buildings surrounding it were old, neglected, and falling apart. The area was quiet, far from the bustling town center, where people were going about their daily lives, unaware of the horrors that had been hiding just beyond their reach. Brian parked the patrol car a few hundred feet from the warehouse, making sure to stay out of sight. He signaled to Duke, and the dog immediately jumped out of the car, his body tense, alert. They moved in slowly, making their way toward the entrance. The door to the warehouse was partially open, just enough to slip inside unnoticed. The inside of the warehouse was dark, the only light coming from a small window high up on the wall. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was covered in debris. It felt abandoned, empty. But Brian wasn't fooled. He could feel the weight of something pressing down on him, like the air itself was thick with secrets. Duke's nose twitched as he sniffed the air. He moved forward cautiously, his steps light, as if sensing something in the shadows. Brian followed closely, his hand resting on his holster. Every inch of him was on high alert. They were getting closer to something. He could feel it. They reached the back of the warehouse, and that's when Brian saw it. A heavy steel door, marked with an old symbol. It looked out of place in an otherwise forgotten building. A chill ran down his spine. This was it. This was where it was all happening. Brian pushed the door open with a creak, and what he saw inside made his blood run cold. The room was full of cages, large metal cages stacked one on top of the other. Each cage contained a girl. Some of them were sleeping, while others were staring blankly at the walls. The room was silent, too silent. Duke let out a low growl, his body tense. He had found the source. This was where it all ended, where the nightmare began. And now it was Brian's job to make sure it ended. The nightmare had just begun, and Brian knew it would take everything he had to stop it. The moment Brian stepped inside the warehouse, the weight of the situation hit him full force. The silence in the room was suffocating. There were no cries, no voices, just the faint, muffled sounds of breathing and the occasional shuffle from behind the cages. The atmosphere was thick with fear, the kind that had settled deep into these walls long before Brian had arrived. These girls, these innocent souls, had been trapped here, hidden from the world for God knows how long. Duke's low growl was the only sound that broke the eerie stillness. The K9, ever vigilant, had his nose pressed to the ground, sniffing the air with a steady, practiced calm. His body was taut, every muscle coiled with readiness. There was something in the air, a sense of danger, a sense that the worst was yet to come. Brian took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the room. The metal cages were stacked haphazardly, some of them more like makeshift prisons than places for people to sleep. Inside, the girls were like ghosts, pale, quiet, broken. Some of them looked too young to be here. Others had the hollow look of someone who had been trapped for far too long. Their faces were downcast, their eyes empty. They had given up, resigned to the nightmare that had become their reality. Brian's heart ached for them, but he knew he had to focus. This was not just about rescuing these girls. It was about bringing down the entire operation. The smell of fear hung in the air, a mixture of sweat and something metallic. Blood, maybe. And then there was that other smell, the one that made his stomach twist, the faint scent of Sister Margaret's perfume. It lingered, as if she had been here recently. Her presence still hung in the room like a dark cloud. "Stay sharp, Duke," Brian muttered under his breath, his voice low but steady. The dog's ears perked at the sound, and Duke's tail gave a single small wag, a silent confirmation that he was ready. Brian couldn't help but marvel at the connection between him and his partner. They were a team, and they'd been through worse. Together, they could face anything. He reached for his radio, his fingers trembling as he pressed the button. "This is Harris. I need backup now. We've got a whole operation going on here. Do not approach until we've secured the area. I repeat, do not approach." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker, confirming the call. The backup was on the way, but Brian knew time was running out. Sister Margaret's network wasn't going to sit idly by while their operation was uncovered. They had to act quickly, before anyone else could slip through their fingers. "Duke, find her!" Brian ordered, his voice hardening. The canine responded immediately, his nose twitching as he moved toward the back of the warehouse, his paws silent against the concrete floor. Brian followed closely, his hand on his holster, his body tense with anticipation. He didn't know what they would find, but he had a feeling that whatever it was, it wouldn't be good. They reached the far corner of the warehouse, where a small office had been set up in the midst of the chaos. It was an odd contrast. A makeshift desk, papers scattered everywhere, and an old computer humming quietly. But it was what was on the desk that caught Brian's attention. A map. The map was covered in markings, red circles drawn around different locations, names scrawled in the margins. Sister Margaret's handwriting. Brian's stomach twisted. The more he looked at it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a map of Springfield or even the surrounding area. This map stretched across the country. There were locations marked in every major city, places where young girls were disappearing, being taken, hidden from the world. This was a network, a web of darkness that had spread far beyond this small town. "Duke, stay!" Brian commanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and fury. He reached for the papers, scanning them quickly, his mind trying to make sense of the chaos. Every name, every location, it all pointed to one thing. This wasn't an isolated operation. This was something much larger. And Sister Margaret was just the tip of the iceberg. The sound of footsteps echoed from the entrance, and Brian's heart jumped into his throat. He immediately turned, his hand on his gun. His worst fear had come true. The backup hadn't arrived yet, and someone was already here. Someone who didn't want to be found. A shadow appeared in the doorway, and Brian's eyes narrowed. It was another woman, but this one wasn't dressed as a nun. She was wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, her face partially obscured by a hat. But even from a distance, Brian could tell she wasn't here by accident. "Who the hell are you?" Brian barked, his voice sharp. The woman froze, her hand hovering over a small bag she was holding. "I'm not here to fight you," she said, her voice steady but tense. "I'm here to clean up the mess Margaret made." "You're in way over your head, Officer Harris." Brian didn't lower his weapon. He had no idea who this woman was, but her words made his blood run cold. She knew who he was. She knew what he had uncovered. And that meant she was part of this operation. The question was, how deep did the rabbit hole go? "Drop the bag," Brian ordered, "and now!" The woman didn't move. Instead, she smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent a chill down Brian's spine. "You really think you can stop us?" she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Before Brian could react, the woman dropped the bag and lunged toward the door. Her movements were fast, practiced, but Brian was faster. He grabbed her arm just as she reached the exit, slamming her against the wall. "Talk to me," he demanded, his face inches from hers. "Tell me everything." The woman's smile faltered for just a moment. Then, as if deciding something in her mind, she whispered, "You're not going to like what you find. But you've already crossed the line, haven't you?" Just then, a series of voices shouted from outside, followed by the sound of boots pounding against the floor. Backup had arrived. But Brian's heart was still racing. The woman was right. They had crossed the line. There was no turning back now. As the officers stormed in, securing the rest of the warehouse, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that they were too late. The operation, the network, it was still out there, still active. And Sister Margaret? She was just one part of it. The truth was out now, but the road ahead was going to be long and dangerous. Brian had come here to rescue a little girl and to bring down a criminal. What he hadn't expected was to find a hidden empire of darkness that spanned the entire country. But he wasn't backing down. This was just the beginning. Brian stood in the middle of the warehouse, the sound of the backup team securing the area buzzing around him. The woman he had caught was now handcuffed and sitting on the floor, her face twisted in defiance as the officers circled her, ready to take her into custody. But there was still so much left unanswered. Her words echoed in his mind. "You're not going to like what you find." What had she meant? What was still out there waiting for them? He couldn't let this go. Not after everything that had happened. The images of the girls, trapped in cages like animals, haunted him. He had rescued Lily, but how many others had been taken? How many lives had been shattered by this dark network that stretched across the country, hidden in plain sight? "Who are you working for?" Brian demanded, his voice sharp, his anger barely contained. He leaned in closer to the woman whose cold eyes never left his. The woman didn't flinch. "You'll find out soon enough," she said, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But trust me, Officer Harris, you're not ready for the truth. You've only seen a small piece of the puzzle. And the people I work for? They don't just disappear. They strike back. Hard." Brian gritted his teeth, but before he could ask her anything else, an officer came over, holding up a file. "We've found something you need to see," he said. Brian's heart dropped. He nodded, turning to follow the officer to the makeshift desk. The file was thick, the kind of thing you didn't want to see, and when the officer opened it, Brian's stomach tightened. Inside were more photographs, more faces of missing girls, some of them even younger than Lily. The photos were stamped with dates from all over the country, places Brian knew all too well. Major cities, small towns, rural areas. The sheer scope of it was overwhelming. "These girls are all connected," the officer said, pointing to the file. "And from what we can tell, they were all taken in the same way, moved through a series of different locations, hidden in plain sight. It's an underground network, much bigger than we thought." Brian's mind was racing. How had they missed this? How had this been operating right under their noses? The operation was sophisticated, the kind of thing that didn't just happen overnight. This was years in the making, possibly decades. The officer continued, "We traced some of the locations back to real estate companies that operate in multiple states. On the surface, they look like legitimate businesses, but when you dig deeper, they're connected to shell companies and fake identities." Brian stared at the photos, a sick feeling in his gut. These weren't just girls being sold for some sick, twisted game. These were lives being destroyed, families torn apart. Some of these girls were still out there, somewhere. And as much as Brian wanted to believe the worst was over, something told him that it wasn't. "What's the next step?" Brian asked, his voice hoarse. "How do we stop this?" The officer hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "We have to go after the people behind it. We can't keep chasing after shadows. If we want to take them down, we need to follow the money. These real estate companies, these shell operations, they're just a front. The real operation is deeper." Brian nodded, already feeling the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. He couldn't just sit back and let this slip away. These girls needed him. The families needed him. And it wasn't just Lily's life that was on the line. There were so many more victims waiting to be saved. But the longer he stood there, looking at the photographs, the more he realized how far this rabbit hole went. This was bigger than just one person or one group of criminals. This was a vast, interconnected network of corruption and exploitation, reaching into the highest levels of society. It was like trying to fight a shadow. It wasn't enough to cut off one head. They had to get to the heart of the beast. "What about Sister Margaret?" Brian asked, his voice hard. "We've got her in custody, but what can she tell us?" The officer shook his head. "She's not talking. Not yet. We've tried everything, but she's playing it close to the chest. She knows we're on to her, and she's not giving anything up." Brian wasn't surprised. People like Sister Margaret, people who lived in the shadows and built their empires on lies, weren't quick to break. It would take more than just pressure to get the information out of her. He needed leverage. He needed something that would break her resolve. That's when it hit him. He turned to the officer, his mind already racing. "Do we have access to any of the girls we rescued? I need to talk to them. They might know something we missed." The officer looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "We're keeping them in a safe house right now. They've been through a lot, but we're doing everything we can to make sure they're safe." Brian didn't hesitate. "Get me in touch with them. One of them might be able to help us." A few hours later, Brian found himself sitting in a quiet room in a safe house, surrounded by the girls who had been rescued from the warehouse. They were young, some of them no older than Lily, and the trauma they had endured was written on their faces. But there was something else there, too. A glimmer of hope, a small flicker of light in their eyes that told Brian they were starting to trust again. He sat across from a girl named Emma, a 14-year-old who had been kept in the warehouse for over a month. She was hesitant at first, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, but Brian didn't rush her. He knew this was going to be hard. For all of them. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to," Brian said gently. "But if you know anything, anything at all, that could help us find the people who did this, now's the time." Emma swallowed hard, then nodded. "I don't know everything, but I know that there's a woman. She's the one in charge. She comes and goes, but she's always got that smile, like she's not scared of anything. She never talks to us, just gives us orders." Brian's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't much, but it was a start. "What does she look like?" Emma hesitated, her brow furrowed in thought. "She wears glasses, and she's always talking about making things right, like she's doing this for a good cause or something. She says she's saving us." Brian clenched his fists. Sister Margaret had been the face of this operation, but now he was starting to see just how deep the lies ran. They had to stop her, and anyone else involved, before she could do any more damage. "What else, Brian asked, leaning forward. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. "There's a building. I don't know exactly where it is, but it's big. It's not far from here, maybe a few miles out. I've heard them talking about it. I think that's where they do the things." Brian's pulse quickened. This was it. The next lead. The next piece of the puzzle. Thank you, Emma, he said softly. You've done more for us than you know. As he left the safe house, his mind raced. They were close now, but the road ahead would be just as dangerous as everything they'd already been through. Sister Margaret's network was vast, and if Emma's information was correct, they were about to uncover the heart of it. This wasn't just about rescuing the girls anymore. This was about taking down an empire, and Brian was ready to go all the way. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The dawn light was just beginning to peek over the horizon as Brian drove down the desolate road, his headlights cutting through the fog. The safe house, a place where the girls were now resting, felt a world away. He knew that the information Emma had given him was the break they needed. But, as the miles passed by, a knot twisted in his stomach. He could feel it. This wasn't just about taking down an operation. This was personal now. The building Emma had described, the one that seemed to be the epicenter of everything, was just ahead. It was tucked away on a quiet stretch of land, surrounded by trees that seemed to swallow the road before it even reached the entrance. It was an old, abandoned warehouse, much like the one they had raided before. But this one felt different. The air was thick, like it had been holding a secret for years, and Brian could feel it in his bones. The moment they stepped inside, it would be the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Duke, ever faithful, sat beside him in the patrol car, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. The dog had been an incredible partner through all of this, and Brian knew he couldn't have come this far without him. They were a team, a bond forged in the heat of danger, sealed by trust and an unspoken understanding. Brian stopped the car 100 yards from the warehouse. He didn't want to get too close, not just yet. He needed a plan. The last thing they needed was to walk in unprepared. He grabbed the radio and contacted his backup. This is Harris. I've located the building. I'm going in now. Stay in position and be ready. Do not approach until I give the signal. The dispatcher confirmed his message. With a deep breath, Brian stepped out of the car, and Duke was right behind him. The dog's senses were on high alert, his body taut and ready for whatever came next. Brian moved quietly, staying low to the ground, his footsteps almost silent as he approached the back of the warehouse. The building loomed over them like a giant, its metal frame rusted and aged, the windows long gone. The faint smell of gasoline and oil hung in the air, mixing with the musty scent of old wood and metal. They had to be close. As they rounded the corner, they spotted a guard. He was sitting in a makeshift office, oblivious to the approaching danger. The man was talking into a radio, his back to them, but Brian knew they couldn't take him lightly. Without a sound, Brian motioned for Duke to stay behind him. They crept closer, and with one swift motion, Brian reached out, grabbing the guard by the collar and pulling him backward. The guard didn't have a chance to react before Brian had him pinned to the ground, his gun drawn and aimed at the man's head. "Who else is inside?" Brian demanded, his voice low but commanding. The guard's eyes widened, but his lips remained sealed. Brian wasn't in the mood for games. He pressed the barrel of his gun against the man's temple. "Tell me what I need to know. Now." The guard hesitated, but the sight of Duke, his massive frame looming over them, eyes cold and unyielding, was enough to crack his resolve. There's a back entrance. Hey," the guard muttered, his voice shaky. "But I don't know who else is inside." "The boss handles all the operations. They come and go." "Who's the boss?" Brian asked, his voice colder now. The guard gulped. "Sister Margaret. But she's not the only one. There are others." Brian's heart skipped a beat. Sister Margaret wasn't alone. His worst fears were starting to take shape. This wasn't just an operation of one or two people. It was a full-blown criminal syndicate. And if Sister Margaret had allies, there was no telling how deep the corruption ran. "Tell me where to find her," Brian pressed. The guard, now trembling, nodded toward the far end of the warehouse. "There's a door. Down there. It leads to the basement. That's where they keep the girls. The ones they're moving. The boss is down there." Brian didn't waste another second. He signaled to Duke, and the two of them moved swiftly toward the entrance the guard had described. As they approached the basement door, the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were suffocating from the weight of the secrets hidden within. Brian knew this was the moment. The stakes had never been higher. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for the lives of those still trapped in the system, and he wouldn't stop until they were all free. He reached for the door handle, but before he could turn it, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approaching from the inside. His hand instinctively went to his gun. It wasn't just Sister Margaret. There were others. In a flash, the door burst open, and Brian found himself face to face with the woman he had been chasing for weeks. Sister Margaret stood before him, flanked by two men, their eyes filled with menace. The faint scent of perfume still clung to her, but now there was a coldness in her eyes that made Brian's blood run cold. "So you finally found me," she said, her voice calm, almost amused. "I wondered how long it would take. You really think you can stop this?" Brian didn't flinch. "I've already stopped you once," he replied, his voice firm. "This time, it's over." The tension in the room was thick, but Duke wasn't waiting for an invitation. The dog lunged, knocking one of the men to the ground with a vicious bark. Brian was on the other, his gun raised and ready. Sister Margaret's eyes flashed with rage. But there was something else there too, something like desperation. She knew this was it.
"Do you think you've won?" she spat. "This isn't the end, Harris. This is just the beginning."
Brian's pulse quickened, but he didn't let her words shake him. He kept his aim steady. "No, Margaret. It's over for you, and it's over for anyone who's been part of this." Duke's teeth sank into the arm of the second man, his growls echoing in the dim light. The struggle didn't last long. Within seconds, both men were subdued, and Sister Margaret was backed into a corner, her smug expression faltering for the first time. "You're done," Brian said, his voice low and filled with resolve. He stepped forward, handcuffing her. "This operation is finished." With the help of backup, the entire warehouse was cleared, and the girls who had been held there were rescued. Some of them were disoriented, others crying, but all of them were alive. And that was all that mattered. As Brian stood outside the warehouse, watching the last of the girls being loaded into an ambulance, he felt a sense of accomplishment, but also something else. A nagging sense that this fight wasn't truly over. There were more criminals out there, more people who needed to be brought to justice. But for now, he could take a breath, knowing that the worst was behind them. Thank you so much for following this story all the way through. It's been an intense ride, and your support means the world. But now, I want to hear from you. What do you think is the biggest challenge when it comes to fighting human trafficking? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together, we can bring more awareness to these important issues.